Okay, so now we'll continue going through the front end, and the further we go in this process, the more it'll become apparent where development has left off, and where we were going and where you might go with this. So the only other page in the front end other than the main index page is the store page. And let me get some reasonable aspect ratio to this. So to get to the store page, we'll enter a store number here, and I'm choosing a store that has, I believe, has more data than some. Okay, so this is the store page. If we go ahead and get our menu bar so we can see the address bar, this is /store. So now we will go through the code that generates this page, the same way we did the index. And then again, we'll make some qualifying statements along the way to point out things that do work, don't work, and a little smoke and mirrors here and there. So once again, coming through our cmlg.py that defines our app, our WSGI app, which is run by Flask, defines it to Apache. So app route /store, whether the HTTP method is get or post, is associated with the function called store. If we stick to our functional programming approach, we'll see that the function store does not require any variable inputs. It is our Flask render template function. And again, we pass it the template, the frame HTML. As we said, that's the only HTML template we're using right now. We pass it the familiar page. Again, that was the middle of the overall page. This is one big cell, and we are drawing it by whatever we put into this page variable. One thing that's different than the index function, we are passing it this thing called store function. That way, if we want to adapt this store page for different results when people search for a MAC address, or if there's other actions that can be done on this page, if we want to come back to store, then we might need to tell the page which function we're using. We'll see. I don't think this is even in use at the moment, but we'll see if it is. And then our familiar stats, database stat, airwave stat, IMC stat, Home Depot stat, our stores table, and then we also now have this store number that we're passing. So as you see with the render template function, you need the first thing you pass, it needs to be the HTML, but then after that, you can define any variables. In our frame HTML, it will use whatever variables we might pass it, but if some variable does not show up in frame HTML, then it'll just be ignored. So that you can never really send it too many variables, but if there's a variable in the HTML that you don't send it, then that could return an error. So if we stop and to see how this store page is built, we're importing CMLG store. So we have CMLG store, and there's functions in here that are specific to the store page. That's why we gave it its own file to keep those functions. And we're importing CMLG base again. Again, we import the base pretty much everywhere we go in the code. We're initializing a few variables. The stores one, this is an example where I couldn't tell you exactly why I ended up instantiating it here, but I can tell you it's most likely because we want to be a list. Python will automatically type variables. So if you try to put a string into store's name and we didn't set it this way, then Python would just consider stores as a string variable. So, but we explicitly want it to be a list, so we defined it that way. Once again, just with the index function, we have sn equals request.form. So if the HTTP request for /store was a get type method, HTTP method, and if there is a store no variable assigned, we're going to go ahead and grab that into SN. If the length of SN is less than 4, then we're going to put a 0 in front of it. Basically, the format, the data format we're using for store to work, it needs to be a 4-digit number. So if someone types in store number 131, right here, we're going to go ahead and make it 0131. Once again, we have our print statement, which doesn't do anything for what shows up in the browser, but it does show up in our Apache logs. So again, that's more for debugging, and whenever we're working in the front end, we generally have this running anyway. And so these are kind of breadcrumbs for us to know where we are in the execution of the script. So as we continue down, refresh Mac equals request.form get refresh Mac. So this is an example of a function that's not fully implemented into the page. When this works, which it does not now, if we want to click this to get new MAC address data from the store, then the action of this form would pass a variable saying, hey, we want to load this page and we want to refresh the MAC. So again, that function is not implemented today, but we went ahead and put here so that if that variable is sent in a GET request, we'll go ahead and pick up the variable, but again, we're not doing anything with it at the moment. Same with MAC. We have it set up so that when people are searching for a MAC address, they can click this, and the MAC address they type here will be sent as a variable called MAC. Again, we're not using this in the code, but the code is ready to receive the variable anyway. So again, this is future development, early development. If refresh MAC is equal to 1, then go ahead and import this CMLG netm. Netm is short for netmiko, because we're using that for SSH. We'll set the stores, which is a list. We're only putting one store number in it, but it's still a list type. And then we'll cmlg netm.store mac main. This function actually does work, and this is how we got these MAC addresses. We'll revisit that when we get to the back end, because that really is a back end function. But we're getting into the realm of things that are half implemented. And this is just a function of where our development last left off. This is a app early development phase. So once again, just as with an index, we need to get all of our statuses so that our platform status lights can be appropriately colored. As before, it's in CMLG base, and the function is called run tests. Comments, these are comments of things, of actual commands, actual syntax, and you'll see that quite a bit where this is an active development environment, and so we'll comment and uncomment things as needed. We have a list, software list, where again we're defining it as a list so that going forward SWS will always be treated as a list by Python. Once again, we start building our page. Again, this is going to be the HTML that actually populates all of this. So we always start with a table, and we're always going to finish off with a table. Again, if we make our atomic, where there's always complete tables, we can embed tables within tables, no problem. But if we try to create snippets that are parts of tables where we start a table and don't end it, once you start nesting it all together, you can get some very strange outcomes. So anytime you see an open table, you should really look at the closed table. And the way we're going to build this page, we're going to come in a row, a cell, and the first thing in the first cell is the CMLG store display store. That is basically this table here. This is the first cell and the first row. So we'll go take a look at display store, CMLG CMLG store display store. In this function, we start a new page variable because, again, this is another function that's just going to return HTML. In this particular case, the page we started building here is going to be the same page and add on whatever this returns. So what is this going to return? Well, it's going to first make a connection to the database, issue a query, select store from stores table, and then execute. We have another stores variable instantiated as a list. We go ahead and take our store number variable, and then here we're formatting it because in the database the stores are stored by ST and then a 4-digit number. We already added our leading 0 if it's a 3-digit number. So we already have 0 in the number, so now we're going to tack on ST to it, so it's in a format that makes sense to the database. Various handling of the store, and then right here, get store. This function is what's going to really go out and get more of the information we need to include in our HTML. So let's go look at get store. Get store, we connect to the database again. We select this time from our table, which is our current table, our most recent table, where store number is equal to store plus store. So basically we're querying the database for the specific store that was requested. We see a begin table, we see an end table, so we know that this function is going to return a complete HTML table. And this is where we go ahead and get the information about the store. We get the store number, we get the VC IP address, we get the MDF1 switch IP address. These are all things coming out of the database that we got with this query. And finally, get store is going to return this HTML table. It's returning that to display store. So that entire HTML table gets returned right here. So right now our page is this table. Well, wait, what if we couldn't do that? Basically, what if that store was not in the database, or for whatever reason we couldn't get a result for that store? Well, if that's not the case, well then, if that is the case, then we'll go ahead and return store not found in the database, return home. So this display store function right here is either going to return the table that has all the store details, or it's going to return a simple message saying that store was not found in the databases. Next, we move on to display switches, display control panel. We won't go through each of those functions individually. It uses a similar technique. It searches a different database table that has a list of switches, and it tries to build this table. And the control panel function tries to build this table. Most of this is not functional. Most of this control panel are in place to move to the next stage in development, but most of them do not function as you'd expect today. Then we continue down. Store function, this is in place so that we can pass this store page various functions and have the output look differently based on the function being run. Because that's not currently implemented, we go ahead and give it, we set it explicitly, store function equals display store. We're doing this just so that we can have the presence of this variable but not actually use it. So once we have our panels built, then we'll move on to dev audit. Dev audit is what produces this. It's what pulls this out of the database. It's MAC address to switch to port to VLAN. When we look at the back end, we'll see how we collected that information, but for the purposes of the front end, remember the front end is always only pulling out of the database. So this device audit is only going to, this will only work for store numbers that we've actually collected MAC address data from. Um, Ultimately, if it's made production, if the MAC address audit part is deployed across the board, then we would scan every store on day one, collecting its MAC address table, and then we would have a button so that at any point you wanted to refresh the MAC data, you'd push that and you'd go get the MAC address data. This is not a function you'd want to run every day against every store, or to run repeatedly against a store, because it does use SSH to log into each switch. It generates network traffic by doing that. It causes CPU interrupts, and it occupies RAM on the devices. So with a script, if you told the script to go check every switch in every store once a day, then you're going to be generating a lot of network traffic. You're going to be interrupting every switch on the network. Um, so this level of audit should not be made automated and regular, but it should be built in. It should be built in where we scan each store at least once, and then we have a means of scanning a store on demand. It's just not something that you'd want to do on a regular basis. And then, as with the index function, once we have our page built, and our page in this context is the entire cell outside of the standard stuff. Once we have that page built as a string variable, we're going to use the Flask markup function and go ahead and basically type that variable as a markup language so that Flask and Jinja 2 can interpret it as HTML. And as before, we're going to return the function, the Flask function render template, passing it our HTML template, which has Jinja 2 tags in it, and then we pass it any variables we want. In our case, we're always going to be passing it a page because that's how we're printing the contents of this cell. The store function we're returning, again, it's not really in use. These forms will send a store function, and this function will read store functions, but then we're not really changing the output based on that value. Then we have our various status values so that our lights can be appropriate. And when we render this template with these variables, this is the result we get.